The Weber Kettle versus the Weber Summitt Kamado. There's about $1,000 difference between these two grills, but is there a $1,000 performance difference? In today's video, we're gonna be using their diffuser plates and smoking up 2 briskets. And I wanna look at key performance differences. Can I tell the difference between each grill? Which grill is more consistent, more reliable, can hold temperatures better than the other? And how easy is it to change and adjust temperatures? Of course, how well does each grill smoke the brisket? And later on, we'll do a taste test. This is part 2 of my series, Kettle versus Kamado Grill. Let's dive in. All right, so if you guys haven't seen it already, I already done a part 1 video where I compared the Weber Kettle versus the Weber Summitt Kamado. And for that video, I just wanted to see which one was a better everyday grill for just basic grilling. So we actually cooked up 2 identical chickens, whole chickens. And at least in my opinion, there definitely wasn't a $1,000 performance difference. I did prefer the Summitt Kamado, but I thought the Kettle Grill did a fantastic job. If you haven't seen that video already, I'll put a link in the description of this video. So today's video is gonna be really simple. I bought 2 briskets. I tried to get very similar briskets. I made sure they were identical weight, had the same fat, marbling, things like that. And then I trimmed them up as best as I could. I usually like to keep about 1/4 of fat on the surface. Sometimes I go as low as like 1/8, but today I added just a bit more fat because this is gonna be dinner for my neighbors and friends and family, and they prefer more fat. And then, you know, when we went to the grocery store, I think I got 14 pounds and a half and some change for each brisket. They were well within each other, so I think that's as good as it's gonna get. We trimmed them up, we squared them off, and then we came out here and got these grills started. Now, as far as like smoking and being more fuel efficient, I'm not really too curious about that. I expect the Summitt Kamado to win, right? And I expect the Summitt Kamado to hold temperatures better and all that. Will it taste better? Will it smoke the food better? I don't know. But I am very curious to test out the diffuser plates and put them both in the smoking setting because they both come with diffuser plates. And there's a very interesting theory that kind of sparked this video. There's a comment that was left by a viewer not too long ago where he had suggested that the Summitt Kamado is a little too efficient, and that makes it a little too clean tasting. You can't really taste the smoke. And with something like a kettle, they're not very efficient, so the combustion process happens a little bit more randomly, which infuses more smoke into the meat. And I thought that was very interesting. So today, really simple, we're gonna go ahead and use Jealous Devil lump charcoal today. I'm using Jealous Devil lump for both grills, the Kamado and the Kettle. And with the Kamado, is very straightforward. Just threw in the lump, and you can put a lot of fuel in the Kamado, and then added in some mesquite, hickory, and oak wood. Now, I like to add a lot more oak, and then like maybe a chunk or 2 of mesquite and hickory, and that's usually like the perfect flavor for me. And then we just put the diffuser plate on there and a tray of water. I put about 1 cup of water in a tray just to keep a moist environment for both. Now, I do want to preference the video by saying this is the first time I'm using the Summitt Kamado in the smoking setup with the diffuser plate. Never smoked with the Summitt Kamado, never done a brisket for sure, so my first time is doing a brisket. A little nervous, but you know, I'm confident. I think it's going to be great. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun, but just know that it's like my first time. I don't know the grill very well. It's a learning curve. So with the Summitt Kamado, it was really straightforward. Put the diffuser plate on there, the tray of water, the grates, warmed it up to about 225, and then started letting it smoke, and it was rock solid. It went to the temperature like fairly quickly, a lot quicker than the Master Touch Premium. And then once I adjusted the vents, it just stayed at 225, and it started making really nice smoke. And then it wasn't too long after that when I started getting nice thin blue smoke. So very impressed with the Kamado. We put the brisket on, fat down, and then we just let it go. With the Master Touch Premium, that was a different story. So right off the bat, the first thing that I noticed was you have to use the ring, right? And you are definitely not using the entire space of the kettle. It's whatever you can fit in that ring. So you're both limited by the height of the ring and the diameter. It doesn't take as much fuel as the Kamado, which is expected. The Kamado is a 24-inch diameter grill, and the kettle's what, 22 or 22 and a half, something like that. So there's a big difference in fuel capacity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that one's gonna be less efficient than the other, right? It just means that one can hold less fuel than the other. So after putting everything in, adding in a diffuser plate, adding in a tray of water, a cup of water, just like with the Summitt Kamado, it was a pain to get it up to temperature. It took forever to get it up past 200 degrees. And keep in mind, the Kamado was it was rolling. The brisket was going in the Kamado. With the Kettle Grill, it just kept fighting me.
Another thing to note with the Master Touch Premium is you got to make sure that the diffuser plate sits flush. So make sure you do a test drive to make sure there's no extra charcoal or wood that are getting in the way.
So let's talk about the parameters for the brisket. So the idea is we're gonna smoke at 225 for at least 2 hours, and then I may or may not bump up the temperatures to 250 early on to try to set a bark. We'll see, we gotta like feel out the grills until we wrap it around 160. And then when we hit 160, depending on the bark again, we'll wrap it, and then depending on the stall, we'll either shoot up the temperatures to 275 or keep it at 250 for the remainder of the cook. I will be spraying them with apple cider vinegar and water throughout, depending on, again, how the bark's setting. Another thing to note, when we go to wrap them, I think that's the perfect time to check the fuel, right? And see how fuel efficient each grill is, and see if we need to top them off. So we'll do that when we wrap. But basically, after we wrap, we're gonna let them go to about 201, something like that. And then we'll take them out, we'll put them in some coolers to rest for a couple hours. So in total, I'm expecting maybe like 14 to 16 hours, depending. Again, we'll see. There might be a disaster today, I don't know. But other than that, I mean, it's gonna be basic stuff. So far, the Master Touch Premium has just been a pain to dial in. It just doesn't want to be consistent. Every time I think I got it, it just kind of runs away from me, and I have to adjust the vents. Again, that's expected. I know what to do with it, so I'm adjusting accordingly. I think the food's still gonna come out great. With the Summitt Kamado, I haven't had to touch it. It's been locked in. It's just so much easier to use the Summitt Kamado. The other thing is, today we're gonna be using the Diffusor sync system. They're wireless probes, and it's an all-in-one package. It's actually my top 3 favorite probes. Diffusor made my top 3 list. If you haven't already, check out that video, but basically I thought Diffusor was the best all-in-one package. It's 2 probes, it has Wi-Fi built in, it's the perfect system to use today. So an interesting thing with the Kamado grill, I haven't hit the stall yet. It's actually behaving very, very on schedule. It's kind of creepy. I'm not really too happy with the bark though, so we're gonna take it to about 165. I'll check it again, and then I'll probably have to take it to 170 to get the bark that I want before we wrap it. The kettle has been behind schedule compared to the Kamado, and it definitely needs to be watched a little closer. So far though, the kettle has been drying out faster, so I've had to spray it a couple times. I sprayed the Kamado a couple times, but I don't think it needs it anymore. I'm keeping an eye on the kettle, and I think the kettle, we're probably gonna get to wrap it a little bit sooner than the Kamado, maybe at 160, but probably 165. Okay, let's talk about smoke real quick, because I know everyone's probably wondering how well does each grill smoke. They're both guzzling smoke. With the Summitt Kamado, it's just been more consistent, easier, and more predictable. Once it hits that piece of wood and the wood ignites, you start getting some smoke. You start getting really clean smoke, like thin blue smoke. With the Master Touch Premium, a little bit more effort. It's not always thin blue, but you can still get really clean smoke with the Master Touch Premium, with the kettle. So far, they're both guzzling smoke, and it's very noticeable. Okay, now that we're wrapping, this is the perfect time to take a peek at the fuel and see if we need to add more charcoal.
So the Weber Summitt Kamado was ready to go. Honestly, I took it all the way up to 170 degrees, and I was nervous going any further than that. Now in hindsight, I'll talk about this later in the video, but that may have been a mistake, because at this point I was still not happy with the bark. Now with that being said, let's take a look at the fuel. I went ahead and removed the grates, the water pan, and of course the diffuser plate. And I was really happy with what I saw. There was plenty of fuel left. I added another chunk of wood to take us to the finish line, and I put the wrapped brisket back in. About 45 minutes later, it was time to wrap the brisket off the Master Touch Premium. I did the same thing, took off the grates, the water pan, and the diffuser plate, and the fuel was almost empty. This was also very expected. My Master Touch Premium could only get me about 6 to maybe 6.5, 7 hours of smoking before I have to refill. So I went ahead and refueled, adding more lump charcoal and another piece of oak wood. And then I put the brisket back in. What kind of sucks about having to refuel is you're almost resetting, because now the Master Touch Premium was finicky again. It was overshooting and undershooting, and I had to keep a close eye and try to dial it in at 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
So the briskets are about done. Let's take them inside, we'll cut them up, and we'll do the taste test.
So we went well into the night, and now it was time for the hardest part, the waiting game. Waiting until the briskets were done, and keeping a close eye on my thermometer. The Summitt Kamado was on schedule and moving faster than the kettle, but the kettle eventually caught up, and I think that's because of the temperature difference. After resting both briskets, it was finally time to unveil. It was like opening a package on Christmas Day. First up was the kettle, and my first impressions were it wasn't that bad. The bark wasn't perfect, but the brisket was bouncing and it was really juicy with great fat rendering. I could barely hang on to this brisket. It was literally falling apart in my hands. I can't wait to try this guy out. But one thing I did notice was the underside of the bark was quite difficult to cut through. There's definitely room to improve with the Weber Kettle brisket, but it's still great barbecue. Up next was the Summitt Kamado's brisket, and right away I can tell it was really juicy. But when I opened it up, I was really disappointed with the bark. The bark did not set in properly. With that being said, it was ridiculously juicy and absolutely falling apart. Its texture was a little bit more like pulled beef. I could shred this with my hands if I wanted to. And I think that has a lot to do with the bark not being set properly. The fat still rendered beautifully, and although I was really disappointed with the bark, I can also tell that this is going to be great barbecue. I can't wait to taste both of these briskets. Let me talk about the two briskets a little bit more and just kind of give you guys my overall take. So I think that both the barks were not perfect. I didn't like either of the barks. The kettle's bark was too tough. It was actually hard to cut into. So it was pretty clear that the underside, not the fat side, but the other side was drying out. And I find that kind of odd because we went fat side down. So I'm not sure what happened there. The only thing I can think of is maybe when I was wrapping it, I miscounted and then I put it fat side up when I had wrapped it. But even then, I mean, I think the inconsistencies with the temperature just kind of threw things off. Now with the Summitt Kamado, there was hardly any bark. And I didn't really know why. I didn't understand what happened. And throughout the entire cook, I was really struggling to hit a good bark on the Summitt Kamado. And actually we took it to 165. We even took it up to 170 and I still wasn't happy with the bark, but I didn't want to go any more than that. I was afraid that, you know, we would dry it out or something like that, or it would cook too fast. In hindsight, I should have probably not wrapped it and just let it go. But I was actually looking back at the footage and I was able to see that I messed up. It was actually user error. I was spritzing the kettle grill because the kettle grill was drying out and I wasn't paying attention, and I was actually also spritzing the brisket on the Kamado grill, and there was no need to do that because if you look at the footage, it was actually still very moist, very juicy. It was not drying out and actually needed to develop a bark, and that was user error. I've done better briskets on the kettle, and I'm just going to chalk it up to, not to make any excuses, but you know, I'm doing two briskets and anything else that the day has. So overall, they both came out really good, super tender, super juicy. I thought the brisket on the kettle grill was going to be way too dry because of all the fluctuations with the temperature, but it ended up being really, really juicy. I was a little concerned with the temperatures. Usually it's a little bit easier to dial it in. I mean, as long as you're like focused on it. But today, for whatever reason, it was a little bit more chaotic. But it doesn't matter because it came out pretty good. With the Summitt grill, everything was perfect. It was really juicy. The fat rendered beautifully, tender, fall off the bone. The only thing that was missing was a solid bark. And actually on both of them,
I mean, you just grab it with your hands and shred it. That's how tender the meat and how juicy the meat was. You don't even need to cut into it. I personally like brisket that's sliced up, that has a bark that's still kind of like intact. It's not necessarily just falling apart. It's not pulled beef, but it was still really neat to see that they actually both ended up being like pulled beef, right? They were just falling apart as soon as you grabbed them. Now, with that being said, how do they taste like? Well, I'm going to be tasting these for the first time with you guys, so haven't had a chance to taste them. Let's taste them together. I have my favorite pieces of each grill's brisket. So let's start off with the Kettle, the Master Touch Premium. Really tender. There was no fat on this piece, but it's still juicy. And there was a bark, and this particular bark was like perfect. This is like what I would want from a bark. It wasn't that hard bark at the end. It was hard to cut through. Let me get a fatty piece. And usually the fatty piece is going to be like loaded with flavor, and it's going to tell you a lot about the brisket. There's a huge rush of flavor. Salt, the pepper, the garlic. I can taste it all. Also smoky, still smoky, and I'm getting a little bit of that aftertaste with the pepper, a little bit of the heat. But I think I'm tasting something. We'll get back to it. Let's try the Summitt Kamado. Again, let's go with the lean piece. Oh, right away. Super tender. Like just falls apart. And I think it's because there's no bark, right? There's nothing holding it together, but it falls apart and it's really juicy. You get like an explosion of flavor. Let's try a fatty piece. Okay. I want to start by saying that both briskets are really, really good. They're fantastic. Here's the thing though. What really stood out to me was the smoky flavor. So the Weber Kettle has a more smoky flavor, but it's not necessarily all good. I can taste a little bit of that bad combustion smoke. It's there. With the Summitt Kamado, it's also smoky, but it's clean. It's like consistent. It's there. It's not overpowering, but it's definitely noticeable. What are my thoughts? Are you getting $1,000 performance difference? So my final thoughts are no, you are not getting an overall $1,000 performance difference, but you are getting a better experience and better food. So I think with the Summitt Kamado, user error, I could have done better on the bark, but the entire time, I mean, whatever temperature I wanted it to be at, it was at that temperature and it would stay at that temperature. There was plenty of fuel left over. It's very fuel efficient. It was smoking beautifully. There's plenty of smoke in the brisket. So I think that initial theory of, oh, it's too efficient, you're not going to get a lot of smoke, I disagree. I do prefer the brisket off the Summitt Kamado as a whole. But when I do get a good piece from the Kettle with the good bark, it's also fantastic. So overall, yes, I prefer the Summitt Kamado. I'm happy I bought it. And I think it's the best charcoal grill on the market right now. And if you're looking for a Kamado, in my opinion, it's in the top 3, right? But if you have a kettle with a little bit more finesse and making sure that you keep your eye on it, you can also make amazing barbecue. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative. And if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel memberships. I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.